I'm here coming to you live from our Midtown Manhattan newsroom. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no other way to say this. The president has coronavirus and we have to talk about it. Luckily, I am not here to talk about it alone. I am joined by Drew Armstrong. He is a senior editor for healthcare at Bloomberg News and 2020 reporter Ryan Teague Beckwith, who also tells me he is something of a constitutional scholar. So we're going to go ahead and test that out today. So thank you both for joining me. We really appreciate it. I know it's like a totally crazy day.
Good to be here.
Hey, thanks.
Hey, so super quickly, I just want to catch everyone up on what we know so far. So Bloomberg broke the scoop last night that Trump's close aide, Hope Hicks, had tested positive for COVID. That set off a series of events and disclosures that ultimately led to the president himself confirming that both he and Melania had tested positive for COVID-19. Is obviously a huge moment in national politics, both in the US and also around the world. And then we also, about a half hour ago, broke the story that Trump had kept his normal schedule after learning about Hope Hicks having coronavirus. So there is going to be a lot of questions about who knew what and when they knew it in the days moving forward. Let's start off with the politics and sort of governance in general. Ryan, we're obviously talking about the leader of the free world having what is potentially, a very serious disease. So sort of doesn't get any bigger than that. What should we know about what's going on in the White House and what comes next?
There have been presidents who got sick. And in fact, there have been presidents who got sick and we didn't know it. John F. Kennedy actually had a secret experimental surgery that was so experimental, it was written up in medical journals at the time, and no one knew it, including his own vice president. So I don't think that the fact that the president has coronavirus is anything that anyone should be concerned about for the governance of the country. Essentially, he's going to be, in his room hanging out. We may see more tweets from him. We may not. But the system of government that next layer down is still working. What there is a potential for here is that this could really interrupt his ability to go campaigning, which he has really wanted to do in person with these rallies. It could make it more difficult for things like we've seen recently. He's been doing a lot of announcements of executive orders. They've had a Supreme Court justice nominee come in and do an event at the Rose Garden. So a lot of those kinds of events are going to have to be curtailed. He's not going to be able to be hosting those until he's no longer positive with the virus.
So in terms of his condition in general, I know obviously we're still reporting a lot of that out. His symptoms have been described as mild. He has canceled his public events. Ryan, as you mentioned, Drew, what should we be looking for? What will doctors be looking for? And does Trump have any risk factors that we should take into consideration as he takes on this disease?
Yeah, let's start with your last question first, because that's a good one. I mean, he's absolutely in a higher risk group. I think we've known all along, and it's been a repeated message from public health authorities that the older you are, or if you have underlying health conditions, you are at greater risk from COVID-19. And Trump is 74 years old. That's a group that, according to the CDC, is 5 times more likely to be hospitalized than younger people. I believe the 18 to 29 group, which has very, very much lower risk than those folks, 90 times greater risk of death than that younger, healthier group. And in addition to that, he is substantially overweight, according to his doctors, which adds another factor. Now, that's not anything special. There are a lot of Americans who are like that, but that's also a reason that a lot of Americans have been particularly susceptible to this disease and why there's 200,000 plus deaths in this country. The things that his doctor is going to be watching for early on, a lot of people start out with a relatively mild incidence of this disease. And for some folks, it just stays exactly that. And there's not a whole lot you might necessarily do to actually treat that if it's the mild form for most patients or typical patients. Now, the president may be an exception. He's going to get probably the best medical care in the world. But they're going to be watching things like his blood oxygen level, which is a good measure of how the lungs are functioning, seeing if he might be developing pneumonia. If that does get worse, they might do something like a chest x-ray to see if there are signs of infection in the lung. And then only after that, typically, do you begin to see more aggressive pharmaceutical treatments that would be put in place if he were to get worse in a week or 10 days.
Great, thank you. And also for those of you just joining me, I see we have thousands across the various platforms. I am here my name is Beth Ponceau. I'm a social editor for Bloomberg News. I'm here in our Midtown Manhattan office, our newsroom in New York City. I am joined by Drew Armstrong. He's the senior editor for healthcare at Bloomberg News, and Ryan Sieg-Beckwith, who's a 2020 reporter. And we are obviously diving in headfirst into the question of what happens next now that it's confirmed that Trump does indeed have COVID-19. So one thing that people are asking about immediately is the question of testing. Ryan, can you talk a little bit about how the testing worked at the White House before this, and what happens now? In terms of contact tracing, or what we're waiting to hear from in terms of results.
The general approach at the White House was to test everyone a lot, and use that to create a sort of protective bubble around the president. They were not as diligent about things like social distancing and mask wearing. In fact, the president himself, sort of from the top down, sent a message that he didn't like mask wearing, that he views it as not a good look for him politically, that if people are wearing masks, then that conveys a message that there's something wrong in the country. And he's been trying to, as much as possible, minimize the pandemic, take the coronavirus off the table as an issue, and talk more about things that he wants to talk about, like Supreme Court justices, law and order, and the economy. So the problem with that approach, obviously, is that someone did get into the bubble somehow. We don't know who or when, probably over the weekend. And then because there weren't other protections in place, then it seems to have spread. Senator Mike Lee of Utah, a Republican who was recently at the White House, who was at the Rose Garden ceremony, was seen without a mask, meeting with Supreme Court Justice nominee Amy Coney Barrett, has just announced that he's tested positive. Obviously, the president and the first lady tested positive. One of his closest aides tested positive. So there's a lot more people who could have been exposed, who could yet test positive in the days to come. And that shows the weakness in this approach. The Biden campaign, by contrast, Biden was doing a lot more virtual events and a lot fewer group events. And as from what I can tell, they had much fewer people within his bubble. And the Trump campaign made a lot of fun of him for that. They criticized him for running quote unquote basement campaign. So we'll see sort of whether Biden keeps to that approach now, or he had been looking to do a little bit more public events as Trump had been as we got closer to the election.
Awesome, got it. And we have a question coming in from Facebook about masks, and which you were just speaking to, Ryan. Drew, what do we know about the effectiveness of masks? I know just as recently as Tuesday, Trump said on the debate stage, Trump was sort of saying the science was a little bit mixed. Can you fill us in on what public health officials say, and talk about how people can protect themselves and what we should know in this context?
Sure, it's a great question, and I'm actually going to pick up on some of what Ryan said and related to testing. I think it's really important to remember here that masks are particularly good at preventing people from getting sick. Tests are really great at finding out who has already gotten sick after the fact. So if you want to talk about the public health strategy of protecting, for example, a political campaign or the White House, masks are going to be one of your best defenses against people in that bubble getting each other infected. The test is going to have some degree of that because you'll be able to find infections, but it may be that you find those infections after the consequences of them have already spread. So they might be effective at limiting the number of people who've been infected or getting some people out who might be infectious and removing them from the bubble, but it doesn't prevent it in the first place. The head of the CDC, Robert Redfield, was testifying before Congress last month, and he actually held up a mask and he said, this is probably more effective right now than any vaccine is going to be. And that's because this is a disease that's spread through respiratory droplets or aerosolized light droplets. And so a mask stops that from spreading. There's a very kind of funny cartoon on the internet that say, if we're all wearing a pair of pants, and someone pees in their pants, the pants stop the pee from getting on everybody else. It's very, very effective when you cover up anything that's coming out of somebody's mouth. In this case, the droplets of virus. So masks tend to work. It's been encouraged We've seen good success in a lot of places in controlling the virus in places that use high mask compliance. And short of a vaccine, those are probably some of the most effective methods that we have right now in stopping transmission of this virus before it happens.
And in terms of sort of proximity, which I know is obviously a question in terms of contagiousness, we did see, obviously Trump shared the debate stage with Joe Biden on Tuesday. What does that say about potential exposure within the debate hall itself? What do we know about the science of how the virus travels and what that could mean for people's potential exposure who were there in the debate hall on Tuesday?
Yeah, I mean, listen, everything we know about this virus is that lots of talking in small confined spaces is basically
shouting.
the best way to possibly spread this virus. And that more or less defines Washington. I mean, I covered Washington for years and years and years, and it's a lot of people talking in small contained rooms. I mean, that is how Washington operates. In terms of the debate stage, obviously there was some distance between the candidates, and I don't think we necessarily know any countermeasures that the Cleveland Clinic may have set up behind the scenes in terms of either air recirculation or UV filters and things like that. But it is certainly worrying that you have, two unmasked candidates talking constantly, in fact, both at the same time through most of the debate for anybody who watched it on Tuesday. That's not necessarily, that certainly is a higher risk situation than either more distance or an outdoor space or less talking or being masked while doing it.
The Cleveland Clinic actually issued a statement just now saying that they've reviewed all of the things that they did and consider it to be a low exposure risk. The candidates and all of their aides came in separate entrances, had separate places. The only time that the two candidates came within each other was those 90 minutes where they were 10 feet apart. So that would be the one possible exposure. We know that some of the Biden campaign people have said that Trump staffers were not wearing masks throughout the space, like during the day, and they were not happy about that. And we do know from our own reporting that a Cleveland Clinic staffer asked members of the Trump family to put on masks, and they declined. So it's a mixed report, but the Cleveland Clinic itself thinks it was not a high risk of exposure.
So I'm seeing quite a few questions on Twitter. I guess this is sort of unsurprising, Ryan, on whether this is some sort of conspiracy, whether this could be done. This has been being put out there for sympathy votes, and obviously there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that this is any sort of ploy. But instead, what I would love for you to talk about a little bit is how this disclosure could hit Trump politically. What does it mean for how he campaigns, and what does it mean for how the American people see his presidency?
Sure. I'd like to address the conspiracy theory thing head on here. In this summer, Clint Watt, with the Foreign Policy Research Institute, put together a list of the 7 biggest risks to the election of foreign disinformation and domestic disinformation. And number 1 was disinformation about vote by mail, which we have already seen. And number 2 was disinformation about one of the candidates getting the coronavirus. And that is already happening. Russia Today has already put up a story saying that Biden has been seen coughing and that this should raise questions about his health. You are going to see things spreading on social media from sources that are not reputable, saying that Biden is definitely sick or trying to slow down video. If you recall, when Hillary Clinton had pneumonia, there was all kinds of sketchy videos where they tried to slow it down and show that she stumbled or claim that she had Parkinson's disease or God knows what. And it is important that people understand that this is a predictable thing now in our politics, and that they not amplify these things within their own social media feeds, and also that they take a step back from the conspiracy theories. One thing I would say, the biggest evidence that this is not a conspiracy theory is that there's really not a lot of good consequences here for the Trump campaign. He has been spending months trying to minimize this virus and trying to change the subject. So for him to come out now and say, I have it, and also that means I have to cancel the big rallies that he clearly both thinks are politically advantageous and also enjoys, just doesn't hold water as a conspiracy theory. Now, I know people who believe in conspiracy theories, it doesn't matter that they're illogical, but take a breath and let's focus on the facts and what we know, and listen to reputable sources.
And just as we are doing this, we are seeing a redhead cross the Bloomberg terminal that Biden has tested negative for COVID, a person familiar says. So that is breaking news here. Any quick reactions from either of you on that news that a person familiar says Biden has tested negative hitting the terminal?
I think one of the main things that's going to be important to keep in mind over the next couple of days, and not related to Vice President Biden, is that, there's going to be this constant testing and monitoring of anybody who may have been in proximity. And it may be that because of the incubation period of this disease, which tends to be 4 to 5 days, that it takes a little bit to turn up some cases, whether they be in Trump's circle, anywhere else around the campaign. So I think you're seeing a lot of news cross about people testing negative. I wouldn't necessarily treat that as definitive so far. With the way these tests works, there has to be enough of the virus for the tests to find. And very early on in an infection, when someone might not be symptomatic yet, they may not have kind of a full infection going on in their respiratory system, it may be harder for some of those tests to turn up that infection. So I think it's worth keeping in mind that just to help people read the news, a negative test today doesn't necessarily mean a negative test tomorrow. A lot of the people in the White House are obviously tested all the time. And some of them are tested, it takes several days typically for them to be symptomatic. So when you have negative tests that then come back positive after they develop symptoms, that's pretty standard. So I hope that helps people read the news without necessarily commenting on any kind of Biden results. But it is worth keeping in mind, certainly.
Absolutely. That's super helpful. And is there a duration that people should keep in mind in terms of, when are folks in the clear? Like, what do we know about that?
I think some of one of the standard metrics has been, 2 back-to-back negative tests 24 hours apart once somebody has been infected. Exposure, we talk about a 14-day period where, typically if you were potentially exposed to the virus, people have been asked to quarantine for 14 days. That's kind of the far end of the incubation period. Most people seem to get symptomatically sick, with those respiratory symptoms within 4 to 5 days. That seems to be what's typical. So most people have an idea by that period. But the self-isolation that happens and the quarantines that happens, that can drag on for quite a while. I mean, we're talking weeks, not just a few days here.
Understood. And we have time for just one more question. And for those of you who are watching and commenting on YouTube, on Facebook, on Twitter, go ahead and put those questions in the comments. We will do our very best after this is over to get to all of them. I see that there are so many, we could never get to them during the live, but we will try our best to get them answered afterward. But Ryan, this one is for you. We have been getting a few questions about the 25th Amendment. So I'm going to let you go ahead and fill our viewers in on what that is and how it relates to this discussion.
I have said before that the Trump administration has been basically just a gift to people teaching constitutional law courses, because there are so many issues that have been brought up over the course of this administration that you could just literally just teach a class just by coming in with a newspaper each day and talking about it. The 25th Amendment is one that came in early on when Trump first became president, and there were some people who really did not like his style and did not like how he was handling the presidency, and were suggesting, couldn't we remove him somehow other than impeachment? 25th Amendment is an amendment to the Constitution that allows for what could happen if a president is incapacitated. And that has not been used, and it doesn't work the way I think that people thought it would. The way that it was being thrown around early in the Trump administration was that this would somehow be like removing the president from office. It's not. It's a temporary measure. The entire cabinet has to get together and vote to declare that the president is incapacitated. And if they all agree, some number of them agree, then the president is sort of temporarily not president, and the vice president, whoever is next in line of succession, becomes president. But there is like a certain number of days after which they have to then vote again to confirm that. And if they don't, then the president goes back to being president. The president can also challenge that and force Congress to get involved to determine whether or not he's incapacitated. And the reason for all of this was that they didn't want a situation where there was essentially a coup against the president, but they also didn't want a situation where the president was clearly developing mental health problems and refused to go. And they needed some kind of mechanism where, if there was really broad agreement among people that there's something wrong, that they could remove him. And the temporary aspect of it is because they also foresaw that there were possibilities for something like a president just being sick or temporarily incapacitated. Presidents have done this when they've gone into surgery and they've sort of said, okay, the vice president's in charge while I'm recuperating from surgery. So this is kind of the situation in which that could happen if the president got really sick and was just incapable of carrying out the daily duties of the job. I don't think we're at that point. I don't think we have any evidence that we're going to get to that point, but it is a fail-safe mechanism that's there, and thankfully so, because we did not have a similar mechanism in past presidencies when Dwight Eisenhower had a heart attack, when Woodrow Wilson had a stroke, and that was an oversight in the Constitution.
Understood. Thank you. So that is all the time we have for today. I really appreciate you both coming on. For those of you who are joining us, thank you. My name is Beth Ponso. I'm a social editor here at Bloomberg. I am joined by Drew Armstrong. He is the senior health editor, and Brian T. Beckwith, who is one of our 2020 campaign reporters. We will put our handles for those of you asking in the comments and in the video that'll be posted for this after the fact, rather than spell everything out. But we really appreciate you all joining us. And obviously, we will continue to monitor this story and bring you all of the developments on Bloomberg.com and the Bloomberg terminal. So be sure to join us there. And we will see you next time. So thank you. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everybody.